The Mahogany classroom. Deciduous tree, one teacher. A tree. A decade of defiance. Deciduous tree. While the government looked the other way, he climbed 30 feet into the air to save a generation. While the government looked the other way, one man climbed 30 feet into the air to save a generation. For 10 years, he conducted lessons on a mahogany limb because his village was denied a building. Watch how a chalkboard nailed to bark eventually forced the state to lay a foundation of stone. The village the maps forgot. If you drive south from provincial capital for 2 hours along a road that turns from asphalt to gravel to reddish mud, and then walk another 40 minutes through cassava fields and stand of tall grass that brush your shoulders, you'll arrive at a place called Equere Junction. It is not on most maps. It was not on the government school district maps, which is why, for the first 3 decades after the village was officially registered as a community, it had no school. Not no good school. No school. Children who wanted an education walked 4 miles each way to the nearest district building, through the mud in the rainy season and the cracked earth of the dry season, arriving late and leaving early to make a home before dark. Most stopped going by 4th grade, not because they weren't smart, not because they didn't want to learn, because the road was too long and the world was organized in a way that had decided their education was somebody else's problem. Solomon Okafor was born in Equere Junction in 1971, the son of a yam farmer and a market trader who had between them a combined education of 11 years and an absolute conviction that their children would go further. Solomon went further. He completed secondary school. He earned a teaching certificate from the state college in 1994. He came home. Everyone expected him to leave again. Everyone who got a certificate left for the city, for the paycheck, for the life that education was supposed to deliver. Solomon came home with a certificate and unpacked his bag in his father's house and said he was going to teach. Someone said, "Teach where? There is no school here." Solomon said, "We'll find somewhere." The mahogany tree at the center of Equere Junction was 200 years old, 60 feet tall, and had a main limb that branched out at 30 feet with a surface area roughly equivalent to 3 school desks pushed together. Solomon looked at that limb for 3 days before he made his decision. On the 4th day, he borrowed a hammer and some nails and a piece of plywood from his neighbor, and he climbed the tree. He began teaching on a Monday morning in January 1995. 11 children showed up, ranging in age from 6 to 14, because the word had gone around the village the way words go in small communities, carried mouth to ear, arriving already changed. Some parents were skeptical. Some were quietly desperate. One father brought his daughter to the base of the tree, looked up at the plywood chalkboard nailed to the bark 30 feet above, and said, "This is where my child is going to school?" Solomon said yes. "Sir, unless you have a better suggestion." The man looked at the tree. He looked at his daughter. He said, "Careful on the way up." The children climbed. Not all of them made the first day. 2 of the younger ones stopped at the second major branch and had to be talked down gently by Solomon, who came to understand very quickly that his job now included a component that teacher training had not covered. By the end of the first week, all 11 were reaching the teaching platform. By the end of the first month, 3 more had joined them. The lessons happened in the open air, 30 feet above the ground, amid the sounds of the village and the forest beyond it. The soft percussion of rain on broad leaves, the calls of weaver birds building their hanging nests in the upper canopy, the distant rhythm of someone's radio from the market quarter. Solomon taught math with rocks gathered from the base of the tree and hauled up in a basket tied to a rope. He taught reading from 3 textbooks he owned personally, passed between children, their spines repaired with adhesive tape that he bought in the city on his quarterly supply runs. He had no salary. The village contributed what it could. Yams, palm oil, a small envelope of naira, when someone had a good market week. He taught anyway. He taught because the alternative was 30 children in Equere Junction growing up without the mathematics to count their own money, or the reading to understand a contract or a ballot. The rains were the greatest difficulty. Tropical downpours had arrived without announcement and turned the air into a wall of water. Solomon rigged a tarpaulin in the canopy, tied to 3 branches with salvage rope, angled to shed water away from the chalkboard and the children. It worked imperfectly. During the worst storms, the lesson became a kind of shared endurance. Solomon shouting the lesson over the rain, the children copying with exercise books tucked under their arms, the ink running in long blue rivers down the pages. They kept going. So, did he? By the third year, the government knew about the tree school. A regional education official had driven out to investigate a complaint. Someone in the provincial capital had heard about it, had apparently found it either embarrassing or amusing, and had sent a junior officer to assess the situation. The junior officer arrived, looked up at Solomon mid-lesson, 30 feet above, chalk in hand, explaining long division to 16 children on a mahogany limb, and wrote in his report that the situation was unconventional but not technically in violation of educational guidelines, since no guidelines existed for aerial instruction. No building was allocated. By the fifth year, a journalist from a Lagos newspaper had written a short piece about the tree school. It ran on page 14. It received some letters. A small NGO sent a donation of textbooks and 2 boxes of chalk. No building was allocated. By the 7th year, an international photographer had published a series of photographs that circulated briefly on the early internet. The photographs showed children climbing toward the camera through shafts of equatorial light, exercise books strapped to their backs, and Solomon at the chalkboard with the whole sky behind him. The images were beautiful. They were widely shared. Foreign newspapers wrote about them. A member of the national legislature mentioned the tree school in a parliamentary session as an example of community resilience. No building was allocated. Solomon had learned something by the 7th year that he had not known in the first, that visibility and action are not the same thing, that a story can travel around the world and return home unchanged, that the government's acknowledgement of a problem is not the same as its intention to solve it. He had also learned something else, that 10 years of children who could read and write and calculate were a more durable argument than any newspaper article. In year 8, one of his first students, a girl named Adaeze, who had climbed that tree at age 9 with her exercise book strapped to her back, graduated from the state university with a degree in civil engineering. She came home for the celebration and stood at the base of the mahogany tree and looked up at the chalkboard, still there, still in use. And then she did something Solomon had not anticipated. She filed a formal legal petition to the State Education Board on behalf of the Aquia Junction community, citing the government's constitutional obligation to provide primary education and the documented 10-year failure to do so. She had learned to read at 30 feet above the ground, in the rain, from a man who paid for his own chalk. She had learned to file legal briefs at the state university. She put both educations to work. The legal petition moved through the state system with the speed characteristic of bureaucracies that have been embarrassed into action, slowly, then all at once. For 14 months, it sat in a review queue. Then Adaeze gave an interview to an American public radio program, and the story of the tree school traveled to audiences who had previously not heard of Aquia Junction. And 3 weeks after the broadcast, the State Education Board issued a formal allocation for a primary school building in Aquia Junction. Construction began on a Tuesday morning in March 2006. Solomon was there when the first concrete was poured. He stood at the edge of the foundation with a group of village elders and watched the mixer turn. And he did not cry, because Solomon was not a man who expressed things that way. But he pressed his hand flat against the ground beside the wet concrete for a moment, the way you press your hand to something to confirm it is real. The building took 8 months. It had 4 classrooms, running water from a cistern, and a proper roof. At the dedication ceremony, the State Education Commissioner gave a speech about the government's commitment to universal education access. Solomon sat in the 3rd row and listened with the expression of a man who has a great deal he could say and has chosen this particular moment to say none of it. He was asked to speak. He stood. He said, "I want to thank the mahogany tree. Without it, none of this would have been necessary." He sat down. The audience laughed. Then they understood. Then they clapped for a long time. He still teaches at Jefferson, not Jefferson Elementary in Columbus, but the school named by the village committee, which named it the Solomon Okafor Primary School over his very loud objections, and then went ahead and did it anyway. He teaches in a room with a proper roof and electric lights and desks that do not require children to balance on a limb. He misses the birds sometimes. He does not miss the rain on his chalkboard, but he notices that the children who grew up climbing the tree are different in a specific way from the ones who began in the building. They are, uniformly, unafraid of heights. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage while it is happening. Solomon Okafor did not stand at the base of a mahogany tree in 1995 and make a heroic decision. He made a practical one. The children needed teaching. There was no building, and there was a tree. The heroism was not in the climbing. It was in the returning. Every morning, for 10 years, through the rain and the official indifference and the beautiful photographs that changed nothing and the legal petitions that eventually changed everything. The government did not build that school because it suddenly grew a conscience. It built it because a girl who learned to read in a tree grew up to become an engineer who filed to write papers. The tree was not just a classroom. It was a machine for producing the future. Every child who is denied a building and taught anyway becomes the argument that eventually wins the building. Education is not what happens in a room. It is what happens when one person decides that another person's mind is worth the climb, whatever the climb looks like, whatever the weather, wherever the branches hold. Find the tree. Teach the class. The foundation comes.